My name is Claire Wardle, and I've been in this space for about 10 years. So when I was putting these slides together, I realized that I had quite a lot of things to talk about when we think about the history of civil society and how we've been working around misinformation. I actually think it's very useful to have this grounding. So I'm going to start with a brief history of the growth of the misinformation field. I'm then going to talk about some of the key civil society players, fact checkers, researchers and think tanks, community organizations and media, human rights organizations. And I'm going to end with just one slide really about how to think about building bridges and connections. So this is the brief history of the growth of the misinformation field, but this is a very important set of brackets. I'm very aware that this is from a US and Western European perspective, and I'm sure many of you will be listening to this being like, well, if she'd come here, she would have seen that this is what we were doing. So I apologize upfront that I will have missed a whole host of things that have been happening around the world. I've tried to be as global as I possibly can be when I have knowledge of something, but please don't take me not including something in your backyard as me not taking it seriously. In fact, I am very excited about learning from you all of the different types of activity happening in civil society in the countries that you're doing your work. So fact-checking is a word that gets discussed all the time. And in fact, this lecture was just going to be on fact-checking. I said, actually, can we expand it? But I think it's important to think about the growth of fact-checking because many conversations around misinformation now hone in on fact-checking as kind of the only tool that we've got. And actually, it's a really important one. It's not the only one. But it is important to think about where it emerged. In the US, again, newsrooms had been doing fact-checking for a long time. You know, they wouldn't run something unless they'd checked the facts. But this guy here, Brooks Jackson, in the US, was the first person to really think about this idea of post hoc fact-checking. And he created something around political advertising in the US called the Ad Police. He worked for CNN, he had an ad watch segment, and he really started kind of putting politicians on the spot and fact-checking their TV political campaigns or their advertisements. And interestingly, it did really have a positive effect. And the quality of political advertisements improved for a while because there was a sense that somebody was looking at them. And in 2003, he founded factcheck.org with Kathleen Hall Jameson at the University of Pennsylvania. And in the US, at least, that's kind of seen as the start of the fact-checking movement. But I think another thing to really think about was that fact-checking was very much about checking political claims, checking political advertisements. And around 2005, actually, I date it back to the tsunami, the Asian tsunami of 26th of December, which was the first news event where many of the pictures were not shot by professional news crews. They were captured by people on their phones. And that was a really big moment in terms of the rise of user-generated content. But as newsrooms started having to rely on this content, they had this challenge of how do we know if it's true or not? It's coming from the audience, but we don't know who to trust. And so on one hand, you had fact checkers who were looking at political claims, but you had the growth of this new field called verification, which was how do you verify particularly images and videos coming from the social web? And for full transparency, that is my background. I started working with the BBC in 2005, and that was very much my background. And actually, it was interesting to go back into the archives. This was a report that I wrote for the BBC in 2008 called UGC at the BBC, Understanding its Impact on Contributors, Non-Contributors and BBC News. And so this was a big moment for the BBC. How do we handle this content coming in? How do we verify whether it's true or not? I then went to work with a startup called Storyful that still exists. They're based in Ireland, although they work globally. And this was a blog post that we wrote in April 24th, 2012 by Malachi Brown, who's now at the New York Times. He recently won a Pulitzer Prize. And he outlined here in these bullet points the different steps that somebody should take to verify user-generated content. And I look back now and I think this was the first time that this process was really written out. And to me, it's a pretty important document, even though at the time, I don't think we recognized what that was going to mean for creating this whole field of people thinking about how do you verify what's true online. The next kind of interesting moment in this growth was Hurricane Sandy. Again, I'm reminding you, this is very US centered, but that big storm that happened at the end of October in 2012, essentially 8 years ago, was this moment where there was a whole slew of fake images and rumors, and it was a real problem. And it was the first time really that people said, hang on, this stuff is circulating on Twitter and Facebook. A lot of it is false. We don't know who to believe. This is a real problem. And so that again was a moment when I was like, hang on, this is only going in one direction, because the scale of the content that I was looking at was significantly more than it had been in 2008. And we were starting to see this escalation. And then in September 2015, we had the launch of the International Fact-Checking Network. And that was the first time that a number of fact checkers came together and said, we actually want to professionalize this work that we're doing because we think it's becoming more important, and we want to kind of have an accreditation process. And they came up with this codes of principles, which is still very important to the work that they do. It's 5 principles, and it's all about commitment to nonpartisanship and fairness, transparency of funding, transparency of methodology, and corrections. And it's a really strong code of principles, and it underpins everything that the fact checkers do. So the fact checkers at this point were still very focused on political claims, political advertising. Oh, let's go back. But this was a Venn diagram actually that Alexios Mansalis, who at the time was the head of the International Fact-Checking Network, he now works at Google, and he kind of came up with this Venn diagram. And he said, we've got the fact checkers on one side, we've got the verification experts on the other, who are kind of working on imageries and video. But then increasingly in the middle is this thing called debunking, this, fake news and viral hoaxes, which kind of sits in between these two fields, which had been quite separate up until that point. We had different conferences, we had different funding streams. And that's a really big lesson from this lecture, is to think about how can we connect the dots, because so many different people are now working on misinformation, but that sometimes leads to duplication, competition, and us not actually moving together in the right direction, because everybody's trying to build up their own networks. So anyway, fact checking and verification were definitely growing at this point, kind of 2016, 2017. And interestingly, this is a very recent piece by Alexios that just got published in a journal, and he actually found evidence that fact checkers used to be very much about political claims, but now, partly because of their funding from Facebook, which we're going to talk about in a minute, they're now much more interested in the debunking part, because Facebook wants them to spend more time debunking. So interestingly, the fact checkers have moved very much into the center. In many ways, a lot of the verification experts have moved into the center. I would put myself in that as well. So it's really interesting when you go back and look at this history. Anyway, First Draft, which is the organization that I helped to create with a number of other people, we came about in June 2015, and we said, right, there's a number of us in the verification space. We would like to start working together in the same way as the fact checkers have. And so we had 9 founding partners, including Bellingcat, that you probably heard about. I mentioned Storyful, Medan at the time, Tom, who's leading the next session, he was working at Medan. So it was this kind of very exciting time where there were a number of people working on all of these different elements of misinformation. Then things started to take a turn. So this is from October 2016. We just had Brexit, and there was rumors and rumblings about whether or not misinformation had played a role in Brexit. We'd had the Philippines election, and there was rumblings of whether or not sock puppet accounts and other types of kind of amplification mechanisms were having an impact in the Philippines. And Maria Ressa, who runs Rappler, she came out, and her team, they created this amazing 3-part series, which I would still recommend you read, about the weaponization of the internet. And this kind of, well, it's all about viral hoaxes and rumors, suddenly started to take this darker turn. And then, of course, in November 2016, we had the election of Donald Trump, and this recognition that misinformation had played a significant role in the results. And what I want to stress here is the US election has disproportionately shaped the misinformation field and has made it disproportionately focused on election disinformation and disproportionately focused on Facebook. And I would often say in meetings, listen, the global problem is health and science misinformation on closed messaging apps. Yet in the US, there's been this tunnel vision on election disinformation. So there were a number of projects that have been funded because they were focused on elections, and there has been a disproportionate focus on Facebook. So it's something I'd love us to discuss because it really has shaped the field in a way that I think has been problematic. So some of you, I'm sure, know that in December 2016, just after the election results, Facebook was under scrutiny for the fact that they had missed all this misinformation, and they set up what's still called the third-party fact-checking project. And they launched with Snopes, PolitiFact, ABC News, and factcheck.org. It is now a huge project, but back in December 2016, they launched with just 4 partners in the US. And it was this idea that content on Facebook would be flagged and it would be downranked in the algorithm if fact checkers had suggested that it was false or misleading. So there's been a lot that's happened with the third-party fact-checking network project, which is important to think about, but this was what it was all about. It was the first time that things were being labeled on Facebook. And one thing I wanted to stress is when you look at civil society, there has been some amazing projects because civil society, which is short on resources, has realized that it's much more effective if it works together. So a little bit like the third-party fact-checking project, on the verification side, this was a project that I worked on with a number of different partners, including Tom, who was at Medan at the time, and it was called Crosscheck. And it was basically this idea that people might be more willing to trust a debunk if you had multiple organizations kind of putting their logo to it. So here's a screenshot, and you can see a little bit, hopefully, some different logos next to the article. And the idea was that if you saw a number of different news outlets, even if you didn't trust one of them, you might trust some of the other ones. So this is what we did in France in the spring of 2017. Tom was involved in a really exciting project in Mexico called Verificado, which similarly brought together a number of different newsrooms and civil society groups to debunk information around the Mexican election in 2018. We did a similar project in Brazil called Comprova, where we worked with 24 newsrooms and civil society. We also worked in Nigeria around that election, similar concept of having different logos next to reporting. And Check Vata in Indonesia similarly took that model and said, what does it look like if we have all of these different partners working together to say that they have debunked something? So you can see there's a pattern developing here. Comprova still is very, very active in Brazil, has been doing a lot of great work around COVID-19. There's been some interesting work around trust and news outlets. So you might have heard of the Trust Project. They essentially work with newsrooms to put this T next to news outlets if they meet certain criteria. They have these trust indicators. They work with a number of news outlets around the world. And it's things like, do you have an ethics policy? Do you have a corrections policy? Are you transparent about funding? It's very similar to the IFCN set of principles. But all of this, you can see there was lots going on. And so I haven't got time to go through everything with you, but there's a couple of things that I think are really worth having a look at. One of them is from RAND, R-A-N-D, and they have a site that is basically a database of tools that fight disinformation online. And they've got 84 different tools. You can search for them and it will bring back different tools that are useful in this space. Similarly, Credibility Coalition has a great database that you can look for tools, projects, initiatives. So I've given you a few, but they've listed a number of them from around the world. I'm sure it's not exhaustive. There might be things in your country that aren't listed here. But again, pretty phenomenal how much has happened in the last, particularly 4 years. And I really want to stress that, which is civil society is really, really active when it comes to misinformation and would be amazing partners. And I think there are some, not people on this in this training, but there are some people I think in the health misinformation space who kind of feel like, well, we should be doing this. And when I hear that, I think, no, that was tried 3 years ago and it doesn't work. Or actually, there's some really good research on that, and maybe you should read that first. Or, oh, you should really talk to this person. They've been thinking about this for 5 years. So I think the one message I want to really spell out is that there is a lot of content, projects, tools out there, and it's really important that you get a sense of the whole landscape. So I just wanted to break down some of those different partners. And firstly, the fact checkers. So Duke Reporters Lab, based at Duke University in North Carolina, they keep an up-to-date database of fact checkers right around the world. And so here you can see that there are 304 active fact checkers. There's about 100 that are inactive, and they keep it updated all the time. So it's a really good resource to see whether there are fact checkers in your location. And it's also worth you taking a look at IFCN, because now it has become a really important accreditation process, because really anybody could set up and say, oh, I'm a fact checker. But as we all know, it's really important to know, how can you trust the fact checkers? If we lose trust in the fact checkers, the whole process breaks. So if you haven't had a look, they have this process. It costs some money. I think it's $200. But what that means is that they have assessors in every part of the world that then looks at the application from the fact checkers, and they also get audited every year, because as you can imagine, a fact-checking organization might start off really, really principled, and then actually after 2 years, they stop being, they get paid off. So they do really good work in keeping up this process. So it's important to think about what this process is, but it's also important to think about IFCN was set up mostly by fact checkers who are experts in political disinformation. And one of the challenges now is, how can health authorities partner with fact checkers to ensure that they have the necessary medical and health expertise for working around an infodemic? So that's, it's exciting, but it's also something that we really need to take seriously. And just to give you a sense of the scale now, I couldn't find an easy one website that would show me how many different fact checkers now are working with Facebook. But remember, I showed you in December 2016, there were 4 partners. There are now an extraordinary number of partners in almost every country around the world. And I don't think can I click through? Yep, here we go. So on this site, for every country, Burundi, Czech, Colombia, 3 different fact checkers working there, Czech Republic. So it's kind of amazing how many different fact checking organizations there are around the world. So I definitely keep an eye on that, because Facebook now has these very strong partnerships. And interestingly, TikTok has just partnered with the same fact checkers to combat misinformation on their platform. And Pointer, which is the home of the International Fact-Checking Network based in Florida in the US, they've also had their own collaboration. They had this amazing Coronavirus Facts Alliance, where over 100 fact checkers around the world started working together to ensure that their coronavirus fact checks were being amplified, and they were supporting each other's work. So another example of why collaboration makes sense. They now have been working with Medan on a WhatsApp bot for fact checkers called CheckBot. So WhatsApp are now partnering with the fact checkers to ensure that different fact checkers around the world can use WhatsApp effectively to debunk rumors on their platform. So you can see we've talked about Facebook, WhatsApp, TikTok, also Instagram has the same fact checking, because Instagram is owned by Facebook, of course. So there's this real move now to have more fact checkers working with platforms. But one thing I wanted to stress is this question of this health misinformation and fact checkers. This is a great report by Full Fact, who are excellent fact checkers based in the UK. They wrote this report back in May of this year about specifically the challenges of fact checkers working around health misinformation, how important it is. So again, really think about which of these fact checkers are taking health misinformation seriously. How are they connected to medical professionals? Does it make sense? It's not all fact checkers are the same professionalism, the same level of expertise, the same connection. So that's just something I wanted to stress. And Full Fact do amazing work. Because here's the problem. This is from the Alliance for Natural Health. As I said, there are a number of people who don't trust the fact checkers. And this is something that we constantly have to be worried about, which is Can anybody be a fact checker? Or how important is that code of principles? How important is it that people are accredited? I mean, there's an argument that says, well, if you have to pay $200 to get accredited, that prevents people in smaller, from low and middle income countries, or maybe a few nurses who've got together to fact check but don't have $200. You know, how does that work? So there's a lot here that we need to think about. And questions about what's the role of government in this. So this is a European Union initiative called EU versus Disinfo, and they do very good work. The problem is it's funded by the European Parliament, and there's a lot of people who say you can't take out the politics from this. So a lot of EU versus Disinfo content is focused on Russia. And so there's this argument, well, they are not truly impartial. And therefore, there are a lot of people who push back and say, well, the EU Parliament shouldn't be sponsoring fact checking. So people from IFCN quite rightly say there is no role for government in fact checking, and fact checkers have to be 100% impartial. What does that look like in a health context? Does that mean, you know, can people be funded by the pharmaceutical industry? Probably not. You know, who can they be funded by? Who can't they be funded by? There's a lot here that we need to think about when it comes to health misinformation and health related fact checking. So I don't know, I just wanted to put this in because I'm a big fan of Dr. Mike, but he has his own YouTube channel, and this is him debunking the Plandemic video. Do you remember that terrible video back in May? And if you look at this, I don't know if you can see, nearly 3 million views on his YouTube channel. He's a doctor in New Jersey in the US, and he just gets on his YouTube channel and he does a lot of debunking. Can he do that? Should he do that? How do we feel about Dr. Mike being a fact checker? There's a lot of questions here about other people coming into this space and saying, how do we ensure that Dr. Mike is trusted? You could argue that we should have 100 Dr. Mikes rather than 100 new fact checkers, because Dr. Mike works as a doctor. Maybe he's exactly the type of person that we want. But similarly, we've had problems with doctors wearing white coats, pushing really problematic content related to COVID. So trust, where trust comes from, who gives that trust, is really critical, and it is not easy by any stretch. This is an interesting piece actually in the Harvard Misinfo review by April Damian and Joseph Garlow, and they basically, it's a call to action for healthcare professionals. They make the argument that there needs to be health literacy. It should be a new field that's taken very seriously, and it should be full of health practitioners working together to be part of the fight against misinformation. So again, worth reading, really interesting. And the last bit in this section, I wanted to give a shout out to some work that's happening between the WHO and Ryerson Social Media Lab. And they're actually doing a survey to try and understand how many different types of organizations are doing fact checking, and where do they sit on this kind of typology that we're talking about. How many of them are certified? How many of them are connected to hospitals or health practitioner organizations? How many of them are just concerned citizens? And what does that mean when we look at the landscape of different people doing fact checking around health misinformation? I think it's going to be really, really interesting in terms of some of the questions that I've raised here. Okay, next, very quickly, researchers and think tanks. I could talk at length about this, and some of you might argue, well, they're not really part of civil society, but I think it's a really critical part of the debate. And I think it's worth just considering how we practitioners connect with academics. So I'm an academic by training. I have a PhD in communication. I left academia 10 years ago because I felt like nobody was reading what I was writing, and I wanted to work in industry. But this is a really great initiative. The Harvard Misinformation Review, they basically do very quick turnaround peer review articles. So the problem with peer review is often it takes a very long time, but this actually is sped up. It can sometimes be just 2 weeks. So it means that the research here is very, very current, and they pull in from a number of different disciplines. So one day you might have a historian, then you might have a social psychologist, then you might have a communication scholar, then you might have a neuroscientist. So they're trying to be a one-stop shop for research around misinformation. You're actually going to hear from Joan Donovan, who was one of the people to start the Misinformation Review later in this training course. She's really great. She's one of my very good friends. But I'm not just saying this because she's a friend. It's a really great resource. But we know from the Johns Hopkins Coronavirus Resource Center, learning from what's happening in the academy, learning what's working, what's not working. The one thing I want to stress is that academia can be just as siloed as civil society. So you often don't have people from computer science talking to people in history. They're not talking to people in journalism. They're not talking to people in communication. And so we have people learning, or they're publishing scholarship about misinformation, but they have no idea how it connects to other disciplines. So one thing I would say is that practitioners can play a really good role in saying, well, hang on, you're from computer science, but what you're saying is really similar to somebody in economics. And I actually think that you guys should talk. So that's one thing that we have to get better at, is connecting the dots between different academic disciplines. And another person I would just give a shout out to is Brian Southwell, also a good friend. I'm just using this as an excuse to talk about friends. We went to grad school together, but he's really, really great. He's a health communication expert. So there's a lot of people who talk about misinformation in academia, but I'd say 90% of them are from politics, political psychology. There's again an emphasis on political disinformation. Brian is by training a health communication expert. And so he's really good at thinking about misinformation specifically in the health sector. And he's written this great piece recently talking about the role of healthcare professionals in slowing down the spread of misinformation. So I just really value people who are coming from different perspectives to this question, because otherwise we get focused again on Facebook political disinformation. And we have to think much more broadly, those of us who are worried about infodemic management. And another example of a great guy is Sander van der Linden, who's based at Cambridge University. He did great work back in 2017 about the idea of inoculating the public against misinformation about climate change. And the reason I put it in here is because many people didn't read Sander's work because they weren't concerned about climate, or it wasn't it wasn't their subject. And so the great work that he did 3 years ago about inoculation is only now starting to kind of filter into health misinformation and political disinformation. And it's just a really good example for me of what we lose by not thinking cross-discipline and not thinking cross-topic. And that I'm really worried about. Health misinformation kind of comes into this space and says health misinformation, and doesn't learn the lessons. Even though I'm telling you it's frustrating that there's been this emphasis on political disinformation, there's still a lot of lessons to be learned that can be applied to health misinformation. Okay, we're coming to an end, I promise. Very quickly about community organizations. This slide makes me sad. And this, I actually think the rest of the world is much, much, much further forward than the US and Western Europe. Many of you, I'm sure, could list a ton of really great examples of community organizations getting engaged in slowing down misinformation, thinking about practical tools and initiatives and projects that are absolutely founded in community. And so I would argue that that's really where the US has to learn. The US has this idea of it's very top down. And I actually think many of you work in places where community is absolutely at the heart of the work that you do. And certainly in terms of misinformation, if we're not listening to communities, if we're not working and partnering with community-based organizations, if we're not really putting them at the center of all of this, we're making huge mistakes, because we have to really focus on this idea that the audience, and I don't even like that word because that feels like it's passive, but people at the end of their phones or seeing posters on the wall or listening to radio, they are networked to each other. They talk to each other. They share content on social media with one another. They are networked. And we have this idea of we just need to broadcast down to the masses and teach them about misinformation. And what we need to do is to be part of the conversations that are happening on the ground, because it's peer-to-peer communication that's going to help us fight infodemics. And that is what I really want us to focus on, because it's just so critical to all of this. And I would argue the last 4 years, almost all of the work that's been done by platforms and civil society and academia and news and media has all been far too focused on a top-down model. And we have missed huge opportunities by not taking a community model seriously. And finally, very quickly, human rights organizations. So organizations like Amnesty, I've been working with for a number of years. They were very early to verification principles because they wanted to verify content that showed human rights abuses. And so I think if we don't bring human rights organizations into these conversations, we miss the fact that we should be having a human rights lens on all of this. If we're thinking about content moderation, we should be thinking about content moderation through a human rights lens. We should be partnering with groups like Witness, who work globally and have really taken misinformation seriously. They are experts in video content, and so they've also become experts in deep fakes and synthetic media. They've worked with activists in Brazil and Indonesia and South Africa. Again, excellent people to know. But who are human rights organizations on the ground in your region or your country, and make sure that they're part of these conversations, because they've got critical perspectives to share in this struggle and challenge that we face in terms of misinformation. So finally, building bridges and connections. Firstly, make sure you know what's happening in your country in all of these different sectors and start building partnerships where you can. There's really no excuse to be like, oh, I didn't know that was happening. We have to be better at doing landscape reviews before we just go ahead and believe that we're the first person to think of an idea, because I promise you, normally somebody else has thought about it, either in another country or already in your country, you just didn't know about it. Secondly, think about where health misinformation is different and where there are important lessons that can be learned from other types of misinformation. So yes, there is a very specific set of characteristics for health misinformation, and the way that we tackle health misinformation is going to require specific ideas and solutions and interventions. But at the same time, there is a lot to be learned, as I've really tried to stress, from other types of misinformation. This is just my own personal beef. Please be wary of claims that technology or technical interventions, sorry about the typo, are the answer. I cannot tell you the amount of people that have told me that blockchain is the answer, artificial intelligence is the answer, they've got a dashboard that's going to solve all the problems, they've got an app that's going to solve all the problems. They are part of the solution, some of them, but please, please, please be careful. There's a very kind of a technical determinist lens to these kind of conversations, that it's not, it has to be a human powered set of interventions if we're really serious about the complexity of the problem and how we solve it. And wherever possible, find ways to build cross-sector knowledge exchange opportunities. As humans, we're really bad at this. We sit in our silos, we sit in our communities, our discussion forums, and that's why this training is so magical, because there are so many of you coming from very different sectors. We need many more examples like this if we're going to learn from one another. And finally, as I said, emphasize interventions based on building resilience within and across communities. And that means we have to do this cross-sector work, because otherwise we're going to fail. So I just talked at you a lot. I apologize, but hopefully that was a kind of a quick whistle-stop tour to this field. And it is a field, it's a very young field, but there's a lot to learn from what's come before these conversations. And I hope that you can learn from them. And I'm going to hand over to Tom in a minute, who's going to do a kind of a skills-based lab. But Tom is an example of somebody who I've known for a while. You know, we've been working in this space for a long time, and I hope that us being part of this training will help you think through what landmines to avoid and which interventions here are really worth taking more seriously. So thank you very much.